Juliet Brodsky speaking with David Levine, formerly the Honourable David Levine, QC, and still is, of course, now Inspector of the Police Integrity Commission of New South Wales. David, it's a great pleasure to be speaking with you for the New South Wales Oral History. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
I'd like to start. I looked at a lovely picture of you that was featured in a Justinian issue some years ago. It's a photograph of you aged, I think, about 6 with your father, who was, of course, Judge Aaron Levine, although he wasn't a judge at that time that the photo was taken. That was about 1950?
My father became a district court judge in 1955. I think that photograph was taken probably in about 1950 in a location in which many members of the bar were photographed. It's in Martin Place, and there used to be a photographer who would just snap you as you were coming down and then hand you the card, and you made up your mind whether you got the photograph.
And your father did?
And my father did. And might I say, I have a photograph of my wife with her mother at exactly the same age, at exactly the same place.
Matching photos of the album?
That's right, yes.
I'd love to know a little bit more about the photograph because I'm interested in your father. He came from New York at the age of 2. He emigrated with his father. His father was a pawnbroker in New York.
My grandfather originally migrated from what is now Belarus to New York at the end of the 19th century. And there he became everything he was by training, a wheelwright. And he became a shirt maker. And when he came to Australia in 1912, when my father was 2, he followed the shirt making business, but in due course opened a pawnbroking shop in Campsie.
So your own father, he grew up in Campsie, or were they originally in Sydney itself?
My father grew up in Canterbury, the neighbouring suburb.
Of course, that was a trade that many Jewish people followed when they came to Sydney, and Russian Jewish migrants. My own grandfather was a Russian Jewish migrant and was a tailor and did all the same sorts of things. And, of course, that was a trade that fell naturally to them. When did your father decide that he was interested in the law?
I can tell you exactly because it has a certain romance to it. When he was 15 and doing what was then known as the Intermediate Certificate at Canterbury Boys High School, the Shakespeare play for compulsory study was The Merchant of Venice. And he came upon Portia's famous speech in Act 4, Scene 1, "The quality of mercy is not strained, droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven." And he told me, when I was quite young, when he read the play and particularly that speech, that convinced him that that was what he was going to be, an advocate or a lawyer.
So with that in mind, he studied subjects that would assist him towards that end?
As far as I know, yes. He would have gone to law school straight from high school, the Leaving Certificate. Then he was a solicitor for a few years and then he went to the bar.
And which firm did he work at when he was a solicitor?
He was articled to a solicitor whose name I believe was Sim Elliott of Elliott and Law.
Did he speak at all about whether that man was an important mentor to him, or did he have other mentors? Did he ever talk about who was important to him when he was in his early years in the legal profession?
Oh yes, there were one person who became a very respected judge, Jock McClemens, was one of his mentors. Another one was Dr. Luar, who practiced in university chambers. He had connections with the Evatt family, and he married into the Lander family, which was prominent in the law. And I'm sure there are others. Sir Cyril Walsh, who eventually became a Justice of the High Court, I can remember. Sir Bernard Sugarman of the Court of Appeal. He was a member, my father, of a generation, that generation of lawyers who were trained, grew up and began their practice during the Great Depression and had their career interrupted in various ways by the Second World War. And they constituted a unique component of our legal history, in my view, the likes of which we'll never see again.
Tell me a little bit more about that. What was your father like? How did circumstances shape him, as it were?
I think my father came from a family. His parents were profoundly concerned that their three children be educated. Now, that's not unique to Russian immigrants, it's common to Greek immigrants or any other nationalistic background. They weren't business people, they were never rich. Strangely enough, my parents never in their whole married life ever owned their own home. They were always tenants. But education and the professions, so that my father, having at the age of 15 decided to do law, his brother became a very prominent periodontist, gum specialist, in fact one of the first recognised internationally after the Second World War. And his sister married a leading educationalist. So the emphasis has been on education and I suppose public service in a sense. That's, my father was deeply conscious of what he saw as the absolute necessity for the rule of law on the one hand and the vital component of justice and indeed mercy if we go back to Portia. And I think those ideas governed his whole life.
Were there specific situations or social affairs as he was attaining his maturity that really impacted him and that, in a sense, furthered his interest in this balance, as you say, between the execution of law and the quality of mercy, if you like?
One of the earliest of which I am aware was when he was an undergraduate or just commencing his professional career in the early 1930s with the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe. And somewhere amongst our family papers we have Ronioed protests, of which my father and his brother were authors and were distributed around the campus. He was deeply conscious of that at that time. And the history that followed in the next 10 to 12 years reaffirmed those tenets in his belief system I've already referred to.
My own grandfather was quite a committed Marxist. Would you say, or would you go so far as to say your father shared some tenets of that philosophy?
No. He was very open-minded politically. And I'm young enough to remember family discussion when the Menzies government proposed to proscribe the Communist Party. And my father was profoundly opposed to that bill because of perhaps the thin edge of the wedge type of concept on the one hand, but on the other, what troubled him about the Communist Party of Australia was that it wasn't controlled in Australia, it was controlled from Moscow. Now, his closest friend, or one of his closest friends, was in fact a committed Marxist, and that is my mother's brother, Morris Lander, whose son Paul would have been Premier of New South Wales, in my view, had he not dropped dead playing tennis at the age of 44. That was the left, the extreme left-wing side, but my father was quite open-minded and would reject any form of totalitarianism, right or left.
That in turn was strongly influential for you, I imagine.
Yes, I I have never been political in the sense of actively participating in any political movement or process or supporting any party. Though I can remember an occasion when I was secretary for debates at the Sydney University Union at the time of the Malaysian confrontation, in which I took a view that was, I think, profoundly anti-President Sukarno of Indonesia. And I can remember another student got up and accused me of being an ASIO agent, and I never felt so flattered in all my life. So that was probably the furthest to the right that I've ever been accused of being. But otherwise I have detached myself from that aspect of politics. If I have an interest that's in government, which should be the noble end of the political engagement in politics.
Government and governance, I imagine.
Yes.